I am delighted to be talking with Simon Critchley. Hi there, Simon.
Hello there, Mark.
Hey, you have written a number of books. The one that I knew from the past was the Book of Dead Philosophers. You're
hmm
an academic philosopher, been in New York for a little while, but were in the UK before. And now you have written, I think it's really a tremendous book on mysticism, which looks
Thank you
at
very
this
much.
subject. Um, and it's really wonderful. It makes lots of great points, and I speak as someone who's quite an enthusiast for mysticism, and tries to follow some of these ways. And I use the word enthusiast advisedly because it's at the end.
Yeah.
But let's try and weave away for at least some of what you say, because I think
hmm
it's really compelling.
Thank you.
And begin with this word mysticism itself. You
Yeah.
you point out that it's a modern word, and
hmm
that is can lead us into all sorts of difficulties right from the get-go.
Yeah.
But you also, and this is one of the things I love about the book, actually, you're not in skeptical mode, you are in expansive mode. So you want to understand the modern use of the word mysticism in order to open up the medieval notion of the mystical, or the
Yeah.
and so on. So look, say more about that. The word, the modern, and then what it obscures from the longer standing practice.
Yeah. There's a really, it's a big issue. And so actually to see the phenomenon that is mysticism is extremely difficult. It creates so many misunderstandings, and it's a misnomer. It literally is a misnomer, the wrong name for the phenomenon. The medieval mystics that I talk about, that people talk about, did not see themselves as mystics, and the category was not available to them. So there's that. So what do we do? And so when I was thinking about this, reading about it, the I borrowed from the French Jesuit psychoanalyst Michel de Certeau, who wrote some really interesting stuff, but it's very scholarly, a scholar of the second half of the 17th century. And he says that the word mysticism, in French, le mystique, really begins in the late 17th century in French. And it describes a shift in the nature, the understanding of religious experience, an idea of gratified passivity, he says, something like that. So it's an early modern, or 17th century modern notion, and then it really doesn't get a grip until after that, 18th century, really 19th century. So it's in that bundle of terms that are all sloppy terms like spirituality and religion itself that don't really capture the phenomenon accurately. So there's that. It's an early modern term, which is so to use the concept is anachronistic. If we say that Julian of Norwich was a mystic, that's an anachronism. She didn't think of herself in those terms. That category wasn't available to her. If the concept originates in the late 17th century in the French context, then it's after the Reformation, and the Reformation is really what changes the whole cadence or the whole nature of religion, and what can be admitted and not admitted. So another part of this, if we're a much longer version of this, would be to think about what happens to what we would call mysticism after Luther and Calvin, and what is lost in that, and a great deal is lost. And at the same time, after Luther and Calvin, you get this incredible explosion of mystical anarchism. Norman Cohn calls it. Various millenarian sects in the German-speaking lands and elsewhere, also in the English Revolution, the 17th century, and so on and so forth. And then things get even more complicated because the adjective mystical does go further back. And as people always say, is to close one's eyes or keep one's mouth shut. That's a definition, which is it's not clear how correct that is. But mystical was linked to participants in mysteries, and the mysteries were notably in the Greek context, the mysteries of Alephsis, and the participants in those mysteries were sworn to secrecy. So that idea of the mystical is there in deep antiquity, and then it enters discourse again in the mystical theology of Dionysius around 5th century, something like that. And so it's a really that's a convoluted answer to a simple question. It's the wrong word, but as so often we're doomed with the wrong word, so we have to kind of make the best of it.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that. But making the best of it is partly doing this kind of inquiry into it. And maybe, when I was reading your book, I was thinking a couple of ways of expressing what has got lost, what's got obscured, that I think really might touch people's own engagement with mysticism. One is that sense that somehow mysticism stands or falls on a peak experience, a religious experience, something that kind of blasts you, preferably. And I feel like the turn to psychedelics, maybe a lot of charismatic religiosity, quite a wide range of questing of one sort or another, stems from this contraction of the mystical compared to the medieval and then prior, like in late antiquity, because it's born of this Reformation, Enlightenment, skeptical moment that's wary of the whole worldview, and so almost needs something to kind of punch through. It's a non-rational kickback almost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And then just to put alongside that, what's so striking as well as you draw out when you talk particularly about Mother Julian, who you've mentioned there already, and Meister Eckhart, Mother Julian's showings are less than 12 hours long, and then she spends decades reflecting upon them. And Meister Eckhart, who might be regarded as the sort of sovereign of mystical writing, never records a single experience. I mean, I think scholars sometimes say he maybe alludes to one once in passing or something, but basically it clearly wasn't important to him. He was doing something else. And so this recovery of what else was going on is why I loved your book. But that's making some sense to you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's I mean, you see, if you say mysticism to people, and I've been saying that a lot in the last few months on a 1,000 million podcasts, it seems, and people think, oh, mysticism, oh yeah, it's like this experience when I was playing golf and the air went out of my lungs and I felt a union with nature, and I want to go, well, it's fine, sure. That's there is that, and then how would you interpret that? How would you make sense of that? So it's the relationship. This is something I borrowed from the great scholar Bernard McGinn, who I lean on a great deal in the book. It's not, mysticism is not reducible to experience. Usually there's some experience, but the question is how that experience is made sense of, how it becomes conceptual, theologically and philosophically, how it becomes articulated in concepts, in words, even when that thing is something which cannot be directly expressed, right? We the whole tradition of negative theology, if we can't speak directly of God or God is incomprehensible, still there's a whole lot of effing of the ineffable which is going on. So I think what people lose is the idea that mysticism gets reduced to this peak experience, which seems to be something that we can find again if we're taking psilocybin and doing an ayahuasca trip in Guatemala or whatever, and that's it, and that's not it. That ignores the discipline and the conceptual rigor, and most importantly, the most important mysticism, as we call it, this misnomer, is something which arises in a context, an institutional context of monasticism and convents, and it arises in the context of a whole set of practices, and if you devote your life like someone that's following the order of St. Benedict to those practices, there might be a moment when you have a peak experience, but it comes out of, the first practice, the most important practice is reading, is lectio, and what the medievals called lectio divina, the prayerful study of scripture. And that's something that monks did, and priests did, and nuns did, and that opened things up. And then there might be an experience, and then that experience could be described and articulated. But so it's as if people want to, ignore the kind of hard work, and also the sheer quantity of suffering that most of the people that we think of as mystics went through, physical suffering and persecution as well. So it is a kind of, as you said, a non-rational kickback, against an overwhelmingly skeptical, rationalistic world, and that's fine, but it misses the phenomenon, and
Yeah. I mean, I think that the sense that what the mystic seeks is contact with a reality that is both within them but is far more than them, and that that intuitive perception, if that's another way of putting it, it's a sort of felt awareness perhaps, can be steady through the ups and downs of experience. And it's why you can read in The Cloud of Unknowing, the author there says to put into the cloud of forgetting all the good and pious thoughts and feelings and experiences you have, quite as much as all the negative ones.
yes,
Because if you dwell in experience, then you might be dwelling with God, but you'll be doing it through the experience. That will be your direct contact, and not therefore with the source of the experience, and whatever it might be. So the mystic, as I've sort of tried to parse it a bit, is wanting to have a steady contact awareness, and then but a thorough engagement with the mind as well as with the heart and as well as with the body.
yes,
And that's what's so remarkable about someone like Mother Julian. That there's these decades where she tries to work out what the showings actually meant, and they become, as you say, they become more and more with the working out.
yeah.
And the revelation sort of continues, but in a very, very different guise.
Yeah, the revelation is, as you said, is brief, and it's one May Day in 1373, and if she'd just written the short text, which is the text which focuses more on the experience that she had, then we could put her alongside a whole host of other men and women that had these extreme experiences. But what makes her so powerful is the fact that she becomes a kind of informal theologian. She is not educated in church Latin, so it's not clear what she was able to read. She describes herself as unlettered, but she clearly was literate in English, so we know very little about her. But she worked out for herself the meaning of Christianity, and along the way, challenged and changed how that Christianity is understood. I mean, she fundamentally, well, for example, she says she saw these things which begin with the seeing of Christ's blood flowing from a crucifix, and this is a kind of window onto a whole series of other showings that she has. But she did not see sin. So there is this really interesting question for her, is she makes sense of what she sees, That's really Julian's approach, and the intensity of her sight is so acute, and she's so attentive to color and to image, and the book is punctuated by these often very homely images of like herring scales and countryside, but what she doesn't see is sin. So how can all be well in a world where there is sin? And she really struggles with that. And in struggling with that, she rewrites the story of the fall and redemption human being, and it's radical. It sits completely at odds with most understandings of that certainly within Catholic Christianity and within Reformed Christianity. She makes
No, she's one of the heroines of the book,
Mm-hmm.
and I think also what I really liked is you do give a sustained reading of these things.
Yes.
And that's very much in the spirit of the mysticism that you're talking about, is
Exactly.
to tease it out, because that then grounds it and radicalizes it. And that is partly what makes it mystical, not just a repetition of a familiar theology.
I'm not a mystic. So I'm not a mystic. I'm not a mystic. I've had some odd things happen to me, happen to many people. But what I do, the work, is the work of reading and the attention that requires. And if I'm doing that reading in a way that is, for me, rigorous and attentive to the text, then I'm held out. I'm held out there. I'm not talking about myself. I'm talking about the text. And there was I had some really, really lovely reviews, but I had a stinker this week in the LRB, a weird review by Patricia Lockwood, and she basically criticizes me for not talking about me. There's nothing about you. And then she I don't know what she understood or read of the book, but and then she talks about herself endlessly, and the point is not that. The point is to attend and to read in a way that you push yourself aside, and that's the essential mystical practice. The last thing that Simone Weil is interested in is Simone Weil. She's interested in what her prayerful activity can attend to, and so there's and this is kind of the puzzle of mysticism, and also the puzzle. What's the right way of putting this? That to be honest, one of the reasons why I wrote the book is that I hate being asked what I do and what I'm writing on, and people just say this all the time. What are you working on? And I say mysticism, and then the great thing about that is it spans things around. I wait, and then they'd start to talk about themselves, and that was fine because I was off the hook, and I didn't have to explain what I was up to because I hate explaining what I'm up to. But so it's an invitation. It's a fantastically invitational topic, mysticism, and that is itself very interesting. You just say mysticism, and then you leave it a few seconds, and people say, well, the golf course, or when I was listening to this piece of music, whatever, and off they go with their their perambulations, and that's fine, but it's not really the point. It gets the issue for me, and what the book is reading, and reading as a form of non-skeptical, intense attention to things. And the reason why I wanted to give in the book a sustained reading of an entire mystical text, because mysticism often lives on in fragments, in small bits and pieces, and that's part of its attraction. I talk about that in the book. It's a kind of tradition of samples. It's a kind of mixtape tradition. But I wanted to do a sustained reading of a text, and that text is Julian's showings, and just to show, over 30, 40, 50 pages, how that works, how she does what she does, and to try and get not her experience taken seriously. That's the easy part, but to get her taken seriously as a philosopher, and an informal philosopher. And that interests me enormously.
Well, let me ask you a little bit more about what you do draw out over those pages.
Yeah.
Because I think that I hope that will encourage people to read those pages and to dwell on them and attend to them as well. So it's almost like a taster, because this business about, well, on the one hand, not being interested in yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You also earlier mentioned the suffering. These are not incidental details
No.
that come about just because of contingencies of times and place. They are deeply interwoven with the mystic's way of life. And I wondered whether you maybe just talk about Mother Julian's hazelnut. And I say that with inverted commas, because you
Yeah.
immediately point out that it wasn't a hazelnut, but it was like a hazelnut.
Like a
And that,
hazelnut.
yeah, and then that leads you, that kind of careful attention leads you to a very different understanding, which I think
Yeah.
I think many Mother Julian scholars would recognize what you're saying. It's not radical in that way, but it is fresh, perhaps, for those who have a sort of haven't paid the attention to the text in the way that you're encouraging us to do.
Yeah, because she, the hazelnut is a kind of, if you go to the Julian of Norwich Study Centre in Norwich, of which I am a member, and I was there in 2019, there were little hazelnuts, and I have, Julian of Norwich tea towels, which are actually just to my right by the cooker. Remarkably robust they've been over the last years. So there is that. There is the hazelnut side of Julian, and we like to think of Julian as a kind of mother affirmation of creation, right? That she's this benevolent mother, very much, a kind of a proto-environmentalist, if you like, which is partly true. I mean, given that the created world was created by God, we have to love it. But she also says, and it's more important, that there can be no created thing between my God and me, so that I have to affirm creation because it's the work of God. Thereby, implicitly, without stating it, she rejects any form of Gnosticism or Marcionite heresy. But she wants to push herself aside in order to and push herself as a creature aside in order to be open to her God, revealed through Christ, and that requires suffering, and that was the first part of your question. So that's really important to remember, is that these people, it's not just after a hard day's week dropping a tablet and feeling weird and thinking, oh, I'm having mystical experiences, but to devote your whole existence, in the case of Julian, to the pledge, the wish to suffer in the way in which Christ suffered, and to suffer Christ's suffering out of love of Christ. And she does this at the age of 30 and a half. She says, I want to receive the 3 wounds, and I want to suffer as Christ suffered. And she wants to die with Christ. And then lo and behold, she does suffer. She is dying, and she describes the suffering in her body. Her legs have gone cold. Her arms are going cold. In the short text, her mother is described in the room. In the long text, her mother disappears. But in both texts, a parson is brought in to administer last rites. So she's dying, and then a boy is accompanying the parson and is carrying a crucifix. And the crucifix, she fixes on the crucifix, and the crucifix begins to bleed. And that's when the showings begin. So it's at the point of death. And she's very non-dramatic. She's not Marjorie Kemp or, the sort of more antical mystics. I'm not even sure Marjorie Kemp is a mystic, but she's not someone that acts out. But this is an incredibly dramatic moment. At the point of death, she begins to experience showings, and then she lives for a good long time and is able to make sense of those showings.
And
we wouldn't get there without suffering. I think is the key point. Then, so it tends to be, and that side of the mystical itinerary tends to get downplayed. I mean, and that's something which I think also has to be just made sense of in terms of our suffering and how we suffer and what we suffer for.
So that participation, maybe it does all sorts of things actually, but one which it reminded me of is some of the more mystically inclined psychotherapists. I work as a psychotherapist, and figures like Donald Winnicott or Wilfred Bion, they will say things like, part of the task of psychotherapy is to show that love is stronger than hate, say, but you can only really know that when you understand the full ferocity of the hate inside you. And that is unpleasant and embarrassing, if not shaming and difficult. So I think there's something about that, as Julian puts it, to know that weal and woe were woven into the fabric of life, but nonetheless that the weal has the last word, and that's why all shall be well, even though she lives in this most horrific of centuries with the Black Death and all sorts of other things. But then there's the theological point as well, which is, to come back to the hazelnut, as you say, that the point is that she saw that everything was as small as something and round like a hazelnut. And the point of that is that she doesn't use the word fragile, but the fragility of its existence, that it will literally fall out of existence. And so it's that becoming to that point of realizing that matter in general, but our lives, the life of all created things, almost sort of hovers on this edge of existence and non-existence, but for the grace of God. And so it's, as I was sort of trying to sort of describe it in my head, what she's communicating is that by seeing that precariousness, then you see the fullness of the divine promise. But it's only through precariousness, if you like, that becomes really seeable, and seeing is a big part of it. Does that echo with what you're drawing out?
Very much so. That's very, very, very well put. Very well put. And there can be no well without woe. The shorthand version of it: all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well, and at the end, all shall be well. There will be. She doesn't say this necessarily, but it's implied. That we will all be saved. We will all be saved, but we don't get there without woe, and woe is, and then how we understand that woe becomes important. And I've got views on that. I mean, I'd like to go back to what you're talking about with mystically informed psychotherapy, because that's interesting. Because obviously the if you like, if we have a whole number of kind of anti-mystics in history, Luther I think of as an anti-mystic, Immanuel Kant, and I think Freud is very much in that tradition. There's mention of the oceanic feeling, but no feeling to go with it. And he also says very clearly, got in one of the meta-psychological papers, hate is older than love, right? Hate is older than love. And So love is all very nice, but hate is older, and that's what really binds us to ourselves. And there is a sense in which the ego instincts, the basic narcissism of what it means to be human, will triumph, and love is a comforting illusion. And I think it's interesting to think about forms of psychotherapy that don't do that. Obviously, Jung comes to mind, but I'm also interested in. I'd be interested to know what you think here. But the person that was on, I don't mention in the book, but I found this. I was going through some old material, some old book boxes actually in the summer, and I found a whole number of things. But one thing I found was a correspondence I had, a brief correspondence with someone called François Roustan, Roustang. And Roustan was a Jesuit again, and he'd been in the circle of Lacan at the beginning. So he was there in Paris in the 50s, but then became increasingly hostile to and opposed to what Lacan was doing for a whole variety of reasons. Wrote a vituperative critique of his former mentor, and he was trying to revive hypnosis. And so he wrote a series of books. One is called "What is Hypnosis? Qu'est-ce que l'hypnose?" and to use hypnotherapy as a way of finding a different way and putting people into a different kind of frame of mind in order to do therapy. And that interests me a lot. I mean, we have this kind of, I do think that psychoanalysis is Protestant in the sense in which, its commitment to the word, right? In the way in which in Luther, it's, it's scripture alone. And for, 1895 or so for Freud, it becomes, the word alone, talk. That's the mechanism that is going to be the path to the unconscious. And I really wonder about that. I really wonder about different forms of therapy that could use different sensory apparatuses, different forms of experience to maybe make all things well. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, my broad thought on this is that various approaches in psychotherapy, and I think the truth is that any practicing psychotherapist or analyst, if you ask them, their range of what they do is probably pretty various because it has to meet the person that you're with. There's no point in just sticking to your one model if the person can't connect. And they are all models, they're maps, not the terrain, as it's sometimes put. And certainly in my circles of psychotherapists, the point is what is going to be, as it's sometimes called, the mutative intervention. The thing that you can do or suggest, and it may be in the room, it may be out of the room, it may be word, it may be play, that can help some sort of change or nudge or new perspective. And that's in a way that's the immediate task of any particular session. And so you might use a whole range of things for that.
What would be a mutative intervention? Through some kind of, because obviously for Freud that might be a parapraxis, a slip of the tongue. I said, you said brother, I meant mother. Whatever it might be. And but what would a mutative intervention look like?
Yeah, it might be a comment that you make. To something simple might be. Now, you mentioned that now, but you remember you mentioned it before in this context. And
right.
if you get your mutative intervention right, it has a sort of ring for the person, and they go, "Oh gosh, I didn't realize that," and it takes them somewhere. So a lot of the art of psychotherapy is saying the right thing in the right moment in order, and that's why it's also a felt undertaking. And what's going on in your countertransference and all the rest of that really matters. But it might be wordless. It might be a moment of breakdown, and how you as the therapist stay with that, maybe even without words, but but that might be very significant because, you know, in the current day, an empathic response is supposed to include comfort and succor. Whereas I think in the psychotherapy room, it's different. You, I think, need to know, at least in some very significant measure, the nature of the suffering that's going on, but not be caught up in the defense or the fear or whatever it might be, the anger about the suffering. Because if you just reflect that back to the person, you just amplify what they're experiencing already. I mean, I often think about this actually in relation to the old doctrine of God's relationship to suffering, which is that God knows of our suffering, but isn't changed by our suffering. And sometimes nowadays this is regarded as a great sort of flaw in traditional theology, because we feel you can't really be alongside someone unless you're sharing the risk as well. But I think that is not much use to anyone, really, at least not after that moment has passed, because you want someone who knows of your suffering for sure, but can keep open the possibility for the future, keep thinking about things. I mean, in psychoanalysis, just to offer another thought, this is often the way that Freud's notion of the Oedipal triad is taken up now. It's sort of demythologized in a way, and understood now as how the third is that which can keep thinking about the binary in which the individual is deeply locked. So it's, you know, maybe them and an experience, or them and another person, or them and, you know, part of their life. And when that person or experience or part of their life is threatened, that's what causes the sense of catastrophe or suffering, because it feels like there's nothing else if I don't grip that binary, you know, which may well have gone back to early states of mind in relation to a mother or parent.
Just in relation to that, I know, we're reverse roles here, but why the hell not?
Yeah.
Is the I mean, how is that? I mean, how much of the therapy that you're doing is online versus in person? Because one of the contexts for the book is the pandemic, and you know, I don't make a great deal of that, but the idea that we became hermits, we became anchorites or anchoresses in the pandemic, and we suffered and we were yearning for something, and then we were also getting by digitally, but it seems to me that the therapy has kind of stayed with that largely, and I wonder about that, because I noticed I teach for my day job, and the qualitative difference between me on Zoom or whatever platform it is versus me in a room is so different. And the mutative interventions, you can feel them in the room. I don't feel those on a Zoom call. I find it's how about that? Is that?
And I think you're right. It did change quite dramatically, quite suddenly. I mean, when I trained, even sending someone an email was regarded as, not a correct boundary maintenance and so on. You had to write letters and all that. So the psychotherapy world has changed, and then almost overnight, certainly within a week or two, the vast majority of people's practices went online when lockdowns kicked in. And since then, I get the sense that most people offer a kind of hybrid practice now. And for myself, I don't feel it makes that much difference, actually. It's not that there's a different kind of quality being in the room with someone as opposed to being in front of someone on a screen. There is, but in terms of, mutative work that you can do, it's just, it maybe takes slightly different forms. I mean, one obvious thing is that when you're with someone in psychotherapy online, it's just you and them. It's not like you and a whole bunch of people on a Zoom meeting. So there's a kind of focus and intensity and a capacity for attention there.
That is indeed true.
Yeah. I mean, I'm also amazed actually how much gets communicated. Well, actually, even through an email. and you learn to pay attention to that, the way that something or someone sort of strikes you, even in the most cursory communication. So I think it maybe depends a little bit on how people work as well as therapists. I mean, I'm relatively chatty probably in therapy compared to some.
Mm.
I think if you were an old style analyst that wanted to sit behind someone's head and basically not say anything, then that would be much harder.
Yeah,
But
right.
on the other
Yeah.
hand, I've heard people say that working with someone on the telephone can be quite like that, and I
Right.
can understand that actually. Again, as long as someone can be on the phone to you in a place where they can feel safe and relax and all that, as long as they've got that space which you in your therapy room might provide with your couch or chair,
Yeah.
then that sort of sense of free association, it's not impossible. I mean, it's hard for all sorts of reasons actually, but not necessarily the way that it's mediated.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. But it's very interesting. Very
yeah.
interesting.
Hey, look, let's turn back. And I mean, it's this is not a very good link, but I just wanted to say one more thing, which you tease out about Mother Julian. You mentioned her asking this question: why is sin behovely? Why is sin necessary? And particularly when she doesn't see it in the showings. And then I think it's in the later text she has this parable of the Lord and the servant, and the servant
Right.
is so sort of excited they run away from the Lord and fall in a ditch.
Yeah.
And so the word fall is reframed, and they've fallen in such a way that they're suffering, and in particular they can't see the face of their Lord, but
Yes.
the Lord is looking on kindly. And as you said, words from nature are very important to Julian, which is, I think, saying that seen aright, all that she's communicated are seen in, as you say, herring scales or clouds or whatever it might be. But also the way she describes Jesus, her Lord God, is kindly, is full of
Yeah.
courtesy,
Yeah.
and so that sense of the steady gaze of the Lord, even when the servant has fallen into the ditch. That's her reframing of these things. It interested me actually because I wrote a book on Dante, and in Fairly
Oh,
High Heavens of Paradise, Beatrice says to Dante that's essentially. Oh no, I've misremembered. It's when actually Dante meets Adam in Fairly High Heavens of Paradise, and he has 3 or 4 questions for Adam, and one of them is, what a bunch of questions around. Well, what actually happened in the Garden of Eden? And Adam says, "We acted too fast. That was the only trouble, and look where it led."
yeah, you bet.
So it's very much like Mother Julian. It felt like, at least.
Well, yeah, he certainly did. They certainly did act too fast, and it had calamitous consequences. I mean, kindness is the central concept, really, in Julian, that we are. God is kind. We are of the same kind as God. We are the same kind amongst each other, and we are all, we're all kinder. We're all children of God, and that if there's a disposition that should be maintained towards others, it's kindness, the kindness that God shows to us. So there is a radical theology of kindness, which I think is terribly important. I mean, at this, without wanting to make things horribly irrelevant, but at a time in whatever we call it, history, I don't know, at a time when people get so much pleasure from being unkind to each other, the simple kindness, and the idea that kindness is a kindness which is linked to, I think, as you said, comfort and succor, or just help. In many ways, you could say the first word of religion is help. and someone will show the kindness to help. And sin in that context is, I mean, the way she describes it is so interesting. It's the out of doing the Lord's, so the parable of the Lord and the servant, out of doing the Lord's bidding so enthusiastically, the servant, us, Adam, we fall into a ditch, into a dell, and we lose sight of our Lord, and we become unhappy. And then God sends out his son to kind of pick us up and to restore our sight of the Lord. So this is the way she understands Christ's kenosis, incarnation, resurrection, all the rest. It's the outflowing of God into human form in order to pick us back up and to ensure, or at least have the expectation, perhaps, that all shall be well. So sin is behovely because we fall and then we can be picked back up. But what I think is, when I was reading, I'd finished the book. I finished the reading of Julian. I'd finished that part, which was in about 22 or so, and then someone sent me this book by David Bentley Hart, That All Shall Be Saved, and I read that with great enthusiasm because he's a universalist, a universal soteriologist, so there could be salvation for us all, and his target is Augustine, really, and the Augustinian emphasis upon original sin, predestination, so on and so forth, and the way that gets focused after the Reformation, and the fact that you can have Christians, like many Christians in the United States, who will believe on the one hand in God and in what's said in the New Testament on the one hand, and on the other hand believe that there'll be an elect of 144,000 and everybody else is going to be burning in hell for eternity, including themselves, and we can't know that. God's grace is inscrutable, and Hart just shows the ridiculousness of that position, right? That it's in fact that it's not there in the New Testament. It's not there in the Church Fathers. It's simply the kind of aberration of misreadings of the Greek by in bad Latin translations, which were the ones that Augustine had access to. So I think that's really good because it gets us away from the idea of original sin, the idea of damnation, and ideas of hell. And I think that there is sin. We sin and hell and damnation. We burn in those fires every day, and that's what it means to be a self most of the time, is to burn in the fires of hell. So I think that's the way I understand it. Sin isn't a place where the damned go. Hell isn't a place where the damned go. Hell is where we are, when we're burning in a kind of egotistical preoccupation, but we can push that aside. We can open up, and that's the if you like, the technique that Simone Weil calls decreation, the undoing of the creature in us, the opening of us to something else, something outside us, ecstasy, and the other things that I call it. So I think it has, the mysticism that I describe in Julian has really pretty dramatic consequences theologically, but very good ones.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I'm a great reader of David Bentley Hart as well, and I was actually really delighted that he actually endorsed my Dante book. It was very nice for me a personal level, but also I was chuffed because one of the things I was trying to get across in Dante is I think Dante is a universalist as well. And this may come as a great surprise because, of course, everyone knows of the Inferno. Unfortunately, fewer know of the Paradiso and the Purgatorio as well. But I think what Dante is doing is the mystical way of understanding these things, actually, which is that you understand universalism only by entering hell, because it's when you can really appreciate the nature of what you encounter, both in hellish states of mind, to be a bit psychotherapeutic about it, but in hellish states of being as well. Is that being itself is the one thing that never lets up. And if being doesn't let up, then that means that the divine presence is there as well. If you like, if you really were cut off from God, you just fall out of existence altogether. And so you get these extraordinary moments in the Inferno. Most notably, perhaps, is that when Virgil and Dante get to the floor of hell, and it's frozen solid, of course, because it's being only just not falling out of existence. They see Lucifer, and it's not like Virgil then goes, okay, look, we've seen the worst, we can turn back and go, climb up again now. No, they climb onto the very body of Lucifer. They keep going and keep going and keep going until it turns around. And then I think that is one of the things that gets unpacked in the Purgatory and the Paradise as well. And so by the end of it, Beatrice and Dante sort of look back down towards the Inferno, and she says, you see, it was almost nothing at all. Which is an extraordinary thing to say, because of course it's been absolutely everything for quite a lot of the journey. But again, there's these kind of paradoxes which you tease out so well in the book as well.
And also, I guess I'm not a Dante scholar. I, read him with great interest, and I have a student, actually, a PhD student, who's working on Dante. So I'm learning little bits and pieces from him, and but this is very important in T.S. Eliot, in the Eliot, and it comes up in the Eliot chapter in the book, which I'm kind of, and he's kind of Eliot. You can see Eliot pushing against his own strong belief in original sin, and what he calls the kind of Jansenism of his upbringing, and he's trying, and in many ways, not arguably, I think Eliot is a great poet of sin, a great poet of misery and despair, wasteland. But in Four Quartets, he's trying to do the opposite, and you can feel the difficulty of the ascent in that sense. And but he does make it, and all shall be well. With the Four Quartets ends with quotations from Julian of Norwich, and then he stops writing poetry in 1942, and that's it. And he's got 20 odd years of life left in him. But this is it. He's turned around, and he can see. He's seen from where he came, and has decided that if you like, it was nothing at all. Right? That's so.
Yeah. I should just mention in passing that you're touching on a few other names like Simone Weil and her notion of decreation. You reference very regularly throughout the book. You also use the work of other writers like Annie Dillard and Carson.
Yeah.
Annie Dillard's book, which you talk about, Holy the Firm, where she has this character Julie Norwich. Again, the thing that I remember more than anything from that is the sort of ferocity of the book. This is not an easy read at all, and yet it's it delivers on its title, Holy the Firm.
She's on fire. I mean, Annie Dillard is a writer on fire, and this is about flame, and a lot of the book is. I think the wildest sections of the book are really in part 2, and there's a chapter on Annie Dillard which I like, because what I'm writing, I didn't really know her work very well. I discovered it in around 2017, 2018, and she talks about the idea that of the flame, and she has this wonderful story of of her camping in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, and she's reading a book by James Ramsay Ullman about Rambo and about Rambo's poetry, or his a kind of fictional biography of Rambo. And this was the book that she read when she was 15, and which got her to believe that she could be a writer. So she's trying to recover a sense of what she's doing as she's camping in the mountains. And then this moth enters a campfire, is attracted by the light and incinerates and burns for 3-4 hours after the moth has died, obviously. And the moth becomes a light to read by. So she's reading this book about the book that got her to write with the flame of the moth. And the conclusion that she draws, or the inference that she draws from that, is that it's to be a writer or an artist in general is to give oneself over to the possibility of fire, and occasionally some people can set themselves aflame, but when someone is on fire, it's not the person you're looking at, it's the fire you're looking at, which is why this we come to the kind of the paradox of mysticism, if you like, but the fact that all the mystics are people who have no interest in themselves. They're interested in the experience that they're trying to reach towards. The paradox is that we end up being interested in them, and then there are operas written about Simone Weil or whatever it might be, fictional biographies of Julian of Norwich. We can't tolerate the idea that there are certain individuals who are capable of setting themselves on fire and doing something absolutely new and transformational. And if they do that, then who they are is of absolutely no importance. So the identity of the writer, the idea that the legitimacy of an artistic practice is guaranteed by the kind of bullshit story that you can tell about yourself, has to be given up. And this presents this hasn't come up in any of the reviews or any of the discussions, which is peculiar. There is a very clear, in my mind, and vituperative critique of the contemporary obsession with identity in the book. It's in many ways what the book is for, and how do we sustain that? And we're talking the day after David Lynch died, who was an artist who was very important to me and very important to many other people, and who I remember he was once asked, he said something, or he was reported, he had an interview. It said somewhere that Eraserhead was your most personal film. Would you care to elucidate that? And Lynch just says, nope. And that's the right answer. You don't need, and who David Lynch was and what it doesn't matter. And so and there are certain artists that have understood that and therefore tell a series of very carefully coordinated lies. And because if you want identity, well, you'll get a false identity. Bob Dylan saying, I was in the carnival for 6 years. He wasn't. A cursory search would reveal that. But the point is that the way in which the various culture industries that are still not exactly standing but falling apart as we speak, the only legitimacy that you can claim for a piece of work is if you can tie it to some identity claim and some narrative of who you are as a person. And we know that's bullshit. Everybody that does interesting work knows that's bullshit, and it's a pity.
So in the mystical, theological guise, or understanding, I should say, you use a phrase, I think, like this is, I am other. And you
Yeah.
talk about how memoir, when it gets obsessed with the person concerned, is sort of dreary and boring. But
Yes.
when the sense of the self is problematized, that's when it starts to get more interesting.
Yeah.
And I mean, a mystic, modern mystic, who you mentioned once or twice, I think, but I've written a book about, coming out shortly, is William Blake. And particularly his
Ah,
later work, he has this regular cry of "annihilate the selfhood in me." And
right.
it's an amazing phrase, really, because you can almost hear him crying it. It's in his longer poems, so it's sort of the voice of Milton, "Come Him," or Albion, or Loss, or someone like that. But nonetheless, that the individual is crying, "Annihilate the selfhood in me," and there's something of the paradox here, which again,
That's in
maybe
his,
there's a
that's in,
yeah,
well,
sorry.
that's in his Milton. That's in the Blake's
Yeah, so
Milton.
It's Milton's, wandering the corridors of heaven and realizing that something's really not right, and then realizes that he has to turn again back to mortal life. And he says, I must die, but sort of consciously,
Mm,
because then when the day of judgment comes, I'll be able consciously to turn to God. Um, and so he says, I must go to eternal death. I must, and then the prayer becomes, annihilate the selfhood in me.
wonderful.
And yeah, the
Wonderful.
selfhood is partly the stories that his spectre has told him about who he is, and it's why the implication, I think, is that this is Blake's understanding of why Satan is rather an appealing character in Paradise Lost.
Yeah.
Hasn't Milton didn't quite understand this part of the spiritual life.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, um,
That's fascinating.
yeah.
That's I just made a note to. I have a copy of Blake's Milton upstairs, and I'm going to go and see if I can find it. Because, yeah, I mean, Blake is on my mind as another kind of informal theologian. Another kind of, there is a whole sort of class dimension to the mystical tradition. I mean, there are some noble aristocrats that become mystics, or wealthy bourgeois people, St. Francis, and so on and so forth. But there's also this, artisanal tradition, or just people from a very humble background that wind up doing something like this. And Blake is, Blake's absolutely fascinating. I wish I'd said more about Blake in the book. But the idea that the mysticism is a heterology. It's a heterology. It has the structure of the I as another. That the way in which mystical autobiography works is through the self being addressed by the other, that is God, and being as emptied as possible by that address, and to annihilate the selfhood in them, annihilate the selfhood in me, in order to be open to something else. And that idea of I as another is absolutely essential. And I think I think it's a polemical point I make somewhere in the book about the autobiographies that don't have that structure just become tedious, because I just don't think that. I mean, maybe there are a few hundred interesting people in the world, and a few hundred interesting people to whom extraordinary things have happened. But most of us, it's just it's the same old trudge, and it's not particularly compelling. But if you can sort of other yourself in this way, and you can enter into a kind of heterology, and I give the examples of Rousseau, with his 3 autobiographies, which are about him as another, one called Rousseau, Judge of Jean-Jacques, and also talk about Nietzsche and Nietzsche's autobiographical work, which works because it still maintains that heterological structure. Why I write such excellent books, why I am a destiny, and so on and so forth. And it's funny as well. So that the writing the story of one's life is always going to be tedious unless you're one of those rare exceptions. So I think we can, annihilate the selfhood in me should be tattooed on our arms. Yes.
And it's I mean um it's an indirect path often. I mean, I think that thinking about this again in relation to psychotherapy, see what you think of this, that I think that there is a moment where understanding something about your, in inverted commas, false self is valuable. But if
Mm-hmm.
you think that the task is to, I don't know, heal or write or manage this sense of yourself that you're discovering initially, then it will become a bit tedious, actually, or you'll just get stuck in your suffering. It'll sort of, there'll be a law of diminishing returns.
Mm-hmm.
But what you can then move, and I think this is where the mystical really adds a crucial second sort of stage, is that having got a better grip on who you thought you were, that's when you can start to use the cloud of unknowing again, put that into the cloud of forgetting, and then stand with the dart of longing love before the cloud of unknowing and reaching out for more. And
Mm-hmm.
you can't in that moment make it happen, if you like. It is grace that you're waiting on, but nonetheless
Yes.
you are ready to receive. And so that active kind of, you talk about this as, I think as well, it's not pure passivity. I mean, you mentioned that at the top,
Right.
but
It's
there is a kind of
an active passivity.
there's an
Yeah.
active part of this, but it is a waiting as well.
Yeah. An active passivity, a kind of middle voice, if you like. It's not passive. So we have this idea of mysticism as a kind of the passive reception of these extreme experiences. That's only part of the way there. It's an activity. It's something which is like prayer. I mean, prayer is a very good example of that. Prayer is something that one does. It's an activity, but it's an activity which is an active passivity, and you are speaking in a way that you surrender yourself to that which you're trying to address. And I mean, prayer is, and people that are unable to pray, incapable of prayer, or unwilling to pray, I think there's a problem there. It should be encouraged. So it's a question of trying to hold yourself in, an expectant, readied passivity, or maybe a kind of waiting, where something might arise, and I think there's there was something else I was going to say in relationship to that, but it's completely
And
flown
I
out
could
of
just
my
burble
head.
for a moment and then come back in. But this, that you talk as well about writers we've mentioned, and also musicians, and I think
Yeah,
that there's an analog here too. I mean, you discussed Nick Cave at one point, and I've heard him
I
talk
do.
about how the way he works, which is he works from 9 to 5. He sits
Yeah,
down, he has a structure, almost something that feels a bit sort of, it's certainly patterned, if not quite liturgical. And in that frame is where the work appears, and it comes and he tests it, and and if he's lucky, as it were, by the end of the day lines come out. But what he doesn't do is wander around waiting for inspiration to sort of hit him from nowhere, which would be a
no,
more passive approach. So the way he describes things in terms of writing music, I think, captures something of this active waiting or passivity.
yeah,
In a way, it does ask everything of you, but only so that you can then put everything of you to one side.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you work. I mean, you work. I mean, it's why we work. It's not. I mean, obviously, other reasons why people work, to make money, and and a lot of people are doing a lot of bullshit jobs and all of that. But if you're lucky enough to do work that is difficult and interesting, and which is to some extent rewarding, you just keep doing it. And I've I heard Nick Cave talking about that in a very interesting way, that you just there has to be a structure to the day, and things have to get done, and you have to at least maintain the discipline of work. Doesn't mean anything's going to happen, but something might happen. And I also link that to the idea. He has this idea of counterpoint. I think this comes up in 20,000 Days on Earth, where you put a snow tiger in a room, and then you throw in a child in there, and then you throw an elephant in there, and then you just see what happens and whether that counterpoint does anything. And it's like that. And I think that in my humble way, writing is something like that, which is always it's always that feeling of not of not knowing where the next thing is going to come from, that you're just trying to hold yourself, maintain a discipline, lose as much noise as you can, and with that discipline then something might arise. It usually doesn't. It very, very often doesn't, but then sometimes it does. And then if you're ready, then it will call and you will hear. And
you reference Nick Cave's discussion of Mary Magdalene going to the tomb early on the first day of the week, and
his favorite line from the New Testament.
And Cave calls it the Jesus idea, that it's as she's waiting and as she doesn't recognize at first, but it's in that moment that the unexpected tug might come, and then everything's changed.
I mean, Christ has been risen, and she doesn't recognize him. Mary Magdalene, the first to find him, and she doesn't recognize him. She thinks it's the gardener. It's the gardener, and then so the non-recognition, of what becomes the recognition event. I think that's really, really important. And Nick Cave is drawing, I believe, on Cynthia Bourgeault's work in this regard. I read some of her towards the end of the book as well. But these ideas are all circling around experiences of surrender. The idea that you can to work is to surrender, surrender oneself, and to wait for something that might tug at your sleeve. And I think that with music, I mean, that's for me, it's I still make vain attempts at writing bits of music, and but it's more the music that I know, that I love, and and then that communion with that, and particularly when you're with someone like my wife who really likes similar sorts of music to me, and they're listening to that together, that kind of submission is, what could be better than that? You're and at that point you believe. No doubt about it.
So maybe coming to a close, because another area that you do touch on towards the end is what difference this revived understanding of mysticism, having reached back and engaged with these figures like Mother Julian. I mean, you had quite a long discussion of Meister Eckhart as well, that we haven't touched on. But what difference it might make to philosophy. This is something that interests me too. I did a PhD on Plato, and I'm just repeatedly frustrated when, say, a figure like Socrates is presented as a kind of rationalist, as if asking questions was just trying to come up with good definitions, or tie up a few knots in your thinking. Radio 4 have got a series on at the minute, and Socrates is very much presented in this way. It's deeply entrenched in people's minds, and I think it's partly because we've lost these older senses, such as the mystical. But there are a few philosophers now who are writing about Socrates and realizing that if he was just tidying up the arguments, he wasn't really doing a very good job, because the arguments are actually either rather simplistic or rather easy to see through, or and then he reaches for strange things like analogy, and they miss, of course, the aporia and the whole significance of that. And I think that this is Socrates, to use the word you were using just then, as reaching a point of surrender. in order
Yes.
then that the more might come through. And that's really the spirit of Socrates.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
he surrenders. There's a mania. There's, Socrates is essentially an erotic being, a desirous being, and so we have to look very seriously at what's going on in dialogues like Symposium and Phaedrus, where the lover can be brought up in the final fourth stage of love through mania to a full perception of that which is and of the gods. And there is the promise of philosophy for Socrates, at least in Plato's telling, and in numerous places in the dialogues, is divine life, is the what Aristotle calls the bios theoretikos, the contemplative life. So the idea that we can the way in which Plato is read is so stupid and has been so stupid for so long. The idea that Socrates is offering a kind of technically sharpened common sense. Right? He's just a kind of a well-meaning, nice, rationalistic chap with straightforward intuitions who's suspicious of the fancy dancing of artists and so on and so forth. It's wildly far off the mark, and we could just we could begin anywhere in Plato's dialogues, and we have to we'd have to that stereotype just won't do. The fact that it's so culturally dominant just perplexes me. It's because we can't really. I think philosophy is. I mean, the story I tell in the book is really that modern philosophy since Kant has narrowed itself to a critical, rationalistic enterprise, which is trying to ward itself against the possibility of the mystical, the enthusiastic, the fanatical, the manic, the excessive, and it's done a very good job of that, which has produced generation upon generation of docile academic types who are very learned in their areas of philosophy, but are not really doing what philosophy was meant to be doing, which was the divine life. And I think I think philosophy is a much more offensive and radical practice in the ancient Greek-speaking world, and we can find that in Plato's dialogues, and again, there, just the lesson would be, reading them in one detail, that the Plato's Republic finishes with this, the weird story of the myth of and the story of the immortality of the soul, which most commentaries don't really deal with because it's sort of a bit embarrassing. And then the day after the Republic has been staged, we get, and he tells us this at the beginning of the Timaeus.
mm-hmm.
The day after, Socrates is out, and he bumps into Critias and Timaeus, and they say a bunch of the weirdest possible shit imaginable about the cosmos. And Socrates, far from being the kind of common sense rationalist, is saying, "Oh, that sounds great. Do say more, Timaeus." And so philosophy has this manic, excessive, God yearning side, which is there throughout its history, and in the last couple of centuries or so, we've decided that's not really what we should be teaching young people, and that's led to this desiccated, deodorized, decaffeinated philosophy that people are presented with, and the horror of horrors, the fact that has led to the renewal of interest in things like Stoicism, and so I could go on, but that's probably enough.
Hey, look, I mean, I share the sense of frustration and You talk about how it's become sort of bloodless critique, but
Bloodless.
just to end well though, rather than with the woe, the whole point of this book is, as you say, why can't philosophy water the flowers? Why can't it
Yes.
discover a whole new mode? And
Yeah.
that's very much the direction of travel in the book. But it comes, as it were, by paying attention, by keeping an eye out, keeping an ear out for what's coming sort of through the words, what pressure is within the words, and staying open to that spirit.
It's very hard. I mean, I mean, I've how would I put this? I mean, it's not exactly welcome what I'm saying. It's certainly in mainstream philosophy at all, and I thrive from that. I love that intensity of antagonism. It kind of keeps me going. But I think that the book is an invitation to to think about something which we're not usually meant to think about as philosophers, and to admit that as part of our as a really big part of our practice. And also it solves a huge problem, which is the kind of the dead white men problem, because most of the people we're dealing with in the mystical tradition happen to be women, and most of the scholars writing about those people happen to be women. So we have a different way of organizing the canon if we let these different things in. And I find that the topic is, as I said before, invitational. That for me, philosophy in the last 100 years or so has got very good at closing itself off, making itself as small and unapproachable as possible, and using the academy as a way of screening philosophy from its public. And my strategy over the years has been to do exactly the opposite, to try and make it invitational, to let people in. So you write a book on mysticism and you get some really weird reactions, some questionable reactions, but it's at least they're reactions. At least something is happening. So I'll take that.
Yeah. Hey, look, well, I'm very glad that you have put together different worlds, and because it does release something. And some of the
Thank
reactions have
you.
been tremendous. I mean, one
Oh
very
yeah.
wonderful reaction was Rowan Williams' review in the New Statesman. So
Oh
hooray for
yeah.
that. Yeah.
No, it's been the reviews have been amazing. It's been, and the amount of messages I've got, it's been overwhelming, really. So it's so something's happening out there.
Hey,
Yeah,
look,
so
well,
it's good.
look, thanks for spending the time talking with me as well, because I appreciate it, and like to spend time in dialogue about it, because that's all part of the cultivation as well. So
Thank
thank
you
you,
very much,
Simon.
Mark. Thank you, Mark.